Okay. Okay, shall we get started? There may be a couple more people coming, but there may not. So, okay. It was hard choosing compelling characters for this talk, and in fact it became a bigger bite than I could chew, historically speaking, because there's so much I could have included and so much I haven't included. And I'm kind of hitting the highlights today, and not yet finding much about Dr. Samuel Ward or really any of the other earlier physicians. I'm merely mentioning here the fellow that left Jackson County to find a clinic in Cincinnati in the late 1800s, giving a paragraph to the pioneer midwives, mentioning the medical society that was responsible for bugging the county council and the county commissioners and their city equivalents to support and fund better health practices and conditions in the county. We may not make it to the end of the 19th century. Speaking of history, not, yeah, okay. But I do want to at least hit the high spots and at the end of a hospital being built and expand into the 20th century. So, but we won't get up to today's hospital. Okay, she's going to get you a chair here.
I know.
Okay. Okay. I hope the details of early ordinances won't bore you, because I found them interesting to follow how health practices changed over the years. And I hang my head for not realizing until this morning that I was confusing the father and son, Doctors Cummings, who span more than a century as county health officers, as well as physicians in Jackson County. So we'll talk a little bit about them, but not in any great detail, because I think some of the information I have is wrong. After the Reno era program, I was criticized for saying I don't know in answer to some questions. And I may do that today, because I'm not going to tell you something if I don't know or have some idea about it. But I'm probably then going to go look for it later and see if I can find any information. But history is one of those things where you can find something today, and a year or so later you may find something different or completely different. Would that be your experience? Yeah, okay. And there's some things that we'll never know. Especially about the Renos, but that's a whole different thing. But it's fun to try, and like the fella in the hole said, just to keep digging deeper and deeper. Our first physician in Jackson County was Dr. James Dudley, who, tradition has it, settled in the county in 1810 before it was Jackson County, and platted the village of Dudleytown in 1837. Dr. A.G. Osterman, a Seymour physician who prepared a paper on early Jackson County physicians for the local medical society, had that paper used as the basis for the Jackson County section of a 1911 book called The Medical History of the State of Indiana. He concluded that the history of early physicians in Jackson County is not very well known, and I would have to second that. Valonia and Brownstown, he wrote, had physicians at the time of Dr. Dudley, but nothing authentic is known of their names and lives. Okay. Slide 2. Dr. Samuel Ward. Spelled W-O-R-T, W-E-R-T, W-I-R-T, and W-A-R-T. I did not find the A-E-I-O, I did not find it with the U. Was born in Pennsylvania in 1794, graduated from Jefferson Medical College in 1810, and after an eventful career in the Spanish Navy and in Mexico, arrived in Brownstown in 1825 and practiced until 1863 when he died. He reportedly was married in Pennsylvania, at least the first time. Buried beside him in the Brownstown Cemetery, the old city cemetery, are 4 other wives. But I think this first grave here is his first wife, Elizabeth. So I'm not sure which one's missing. And his descendants who have researched him are not real sure either. He was the first president of the Jackson County Medical Society. And I'm told that the minutes of the Medical Society are over in the hospital. And if that's the case, I didn't make it over there to get to see him, but working on it. I don't know.
Number one.
Dr. Osterman described the early days as offering scarcely any well-defined roads, and patients were far apart. Visits were made on horseback, and the ample saddlebags were always the badge of the doctor. Roots, herbs, bark, and barks were the armamentorium of the practitioner. Calomel and jalap were dealt unsparingly. The bitter Peruvian bark and the lancet were their only fever remedies. Anesthesia was unknown, but this did not deter the doctors from performing major and minor operations. They worked sometimes under the most trying conditions, end of quote. Dr. Osterman wrote that those historic early days were no less trying for the physicians than for the patients. I guess it would have been kind of a toss-up. Yet with all this seeming primitiveness and limited means of practicing medicine and surgery, he wrote, these men were successful and their patients lived to bless them. The earlier and older ones have all passed away. Some rest in unmarked graves. They performed often without reward at the call of their patients at any hour, in the storm and stress and midnight hour, and nothing to guide them, and sometimes straying off the road and path. Less known than the trials of the physicians were those of the women able to nurse their neighbors, who may have been many miles distant. They traveled in the same darkness, crossed the same swollen or icy streams, up over hills and down into valleys, often without horse or companion to act as midwife or nurse. One such woman was Mrs. William Cross, born Miriam Mormon, I'm told. She was much praised for waiting on and caring for the sick. It was no rare occurrence for her to ride 10 to 12 miles in the dark through woods and rain and snow to visit and care for some poor sufferer. Her husband died in 1861. She survived until 1885, when at the age of 79, she ironically died after an 8-month illness caused by typhoid fever. She was one of the earliest settlers of Salt Creek Township and had resided on the farm 2 miles northeast of Houston since 1832. You have to admire that. I wonder if she did indeed live alone, or I had a great-grandmother who lived alone out on the frontier in northern Indiana for a year after her husband died and before her brothers could move out to be neighbors. But man. Families learned what they could from the doctors they encountered, but they used folk remedies to do much of their own doctoring. Modern science has proved some folk remedies effective, but Hoosiers had to be tough to survive other cures. Presbyterian preachers reporting to the American Missionary Society noted diseases being so prevalent in Jackson County. They found it not uncommon for a family to lose several members in a week, especially children. I remember helping read a cemetery up at, I think it was White's Chapel, and there's two parents are buried there, but in a row down from them are at least half a dozen stones of children that died at a very early, when they were children. Bloodletting began to be discredited as a treatment eventually. Can you imagine the cure of having leeches applied to your skin? Doesn't that just do things for you? Diseases were erysipelas, scarlatina, dysentery, smallpox, milk sickness, cholera. In 1849 to 52, especially along navigable waters that would be carried along with the people traveling those waters. In 1849, cholera came into this area with German immigrants coming up from New Orleans by the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. Many immigrants died along with residents, including Dr. Isaac Finley, who in 1844 had moved from Jackson County to Columbus. So I don't know whether he died here or in Columbus, presumably in Columbus, but he was mentioned as one with connections here. The doctors denounced what they said was the quackery of incompetence and reckless practitioners of medicine and surgery, as well as those who dispensed drugs indiscriminately. Laws were enacted as early as 1816 to regulate the practice of medicine in Indiana, but most had been repealed by 1850. I'd like to know more about that. I don't know. Why? Okay. Vaccinations began to be urged in the 1860s, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And for whatever it was worth, as early as 1819, in Jackson County, Jonas Crane was appointed to inspect flour, beef, and pork. I wonder what else is out there in the commissioner's records that I haven't come across yet. It'd be interesting to know. Okay, this is an excerpt from the Sanborn Fire Insurance map for Brownstown in 1899. That's kind of skipping around, but it makes the point that I need to make, which is that this says well and pump. Here's where the courthouse is. There's the Aetna House. Here's People's Bank and the Opry House. And, okay. So you know where I'm talking about, right? I mean, everybody's with me there. Okay. So this is in front of the bank. It's across the street. The pump that's shown there is across the street from the one in the previous slide. But it's still one of the wells that was there. And we'll talk. Well, eventually a custodian at the courthouse was told to remove a second pipe from the pump on the square. And I don't know if they talk about this one or the other one, or maybe still a further one. Told to remove the pipe so that, which town folk and visitors had been able to go to for a drink while they were in town, of water. I mean, they could find plenty of other stuff. So they then, after that, had to carry their own drinking cups. So have any of you ever seen those little folding tin cups? Yeah, and wondered why? And I had read they were Civil War related, but I can see people buying them at that point to be able to get a drink instead of drinking out of their very probably dirty hands, I'm guessing, after handling horses and whatever else. Okay, and again around 1900, and then as the interurban came in, the cars that carried drinking water had water in the corner where you couldn't have the dipper and the bucket anymore. You had to have something with cups for them to drink out of. So I'm sure there were people that were relieved by that. Okay, a little further back into the past now that I've jumped ahead there, but I wanted to get that up there. Before Seymour's first train robbery, town authorities in July 1865 passed an ordinance establishing a Board of Health, and in November 1865 the council appointed a Board of Health composed of Doctors J.F.W. Garish, William H. Price, and Amos Frost, who had been inspecting various nuisances around town, and it was their opinion, and this is quote, that any epidemic disease disposed to visit the place would find everything in a highly satisfactory condition for its full development. In other words, any disease in Seymour would find great conditions for flourishing. This was about a year before the Reno brothers robbed a train at the east edge of Seymour, and 13 years after Needy Shields established his town derisively called the Mill Crossing. The new ordinance gave the health board, this is quotes again, the power to establish, publish, and enforce all bylaws, rules, and regulations necessary for exacting the observance by all inhabitants and visitors to said city of all such sanitary regulations and restrictions as may be deemed by the board best calculated to prevent the prevalence and spread among them of such diseases as aforesaid, for requiring all inhabitants of said city who may not have had the smallpox and not been protected against it by vaccination to report and submit themselves to vaccination, and for prohibiting all children not so protected from admission into any public school of said city. 65. By July 1866, about 7 months later, Board of Health was, after the Board of Health was, let me try that again. By July 1866, about 7 months after the Board of Health was appointed, the Seymour Times, whose editor and publisher was Dr. J.R. Monroe, who also was a practicing physician, took the council to task for refusing to fill and cover up that fetid and loathsome and disease-engendering pool of quagmire and water, unquote, where the old Shields Mill stood between the Methodist Church, then probably at 2nd and Ewing, not before it moved up to 3rd and Ewing, and the railroad. And according to one person who's lived here all his life and took me around town to show me, the area being talked about was back of what is now Bite the Bullet, isn't that the name of it? But yeah, back of that they had a fenced-in yard there for a long time that was a swamp up into his memory. I'd like to read more about that, but I doubt that I will be able to find that. Okay, Dr. Monroe knew whereof he wrote. He was a graduate with distinction from the Kentucky School of Medicine in Louisville in 1858, after more than a decade of practice in Rockford and Seymour, which was his earlier training had been followed by reading medicine in the offices of various South Central Indiana physicians. He had served briefly as a surgeon at Cumberland Gap during the Civil War, but he just couldn't handle it. Basically, they said he had 100 miles and like 400 patients to take care of, which is just unimaginable to me. Anyway, his mental and physical exhaustion caused him to resign, but this was in 1862, even as the war went on, the governor, you can read the telegrams online, Governor Morton would telegraph him and say, can you get some people together and take them down to wherever they needed a field hospital. So he'd round up physicians here in the area and they'd hop on the train and go south. Dr. Monroe wrote in the summer of 1866 that the Board of Health had pronounced the Seymour quagmire a nuisance more than 2 months earlier and did what it could to have the nuisance abated, but the authorities paid no attention to the recommendations. In other words, the county council said, until after the threat had been called privately and publicly to the attention of the mayor and the marshal, who finally gave owners proper notice that they needed to clean it up. Eventually, a few decaying logs were removed, but the condition of the lot had not been improved. The water still had no channel through which to drain. And by the industrious efforts of hogs, cattle, and geese, it is converted into a putrid cesspool quite capable of producing cholera. Monroe wrote that the council had neglected its duty. All families living within 200 yards of this festering sink are directly affected by its miasmatic poison. I cannot pronounce some of these words. And there is no estimating how far its deleterious efforts may extend. We urge the Board of Health to make another effort to have the area drained. It is in the very center of town, and though they who live immediately about it suffer the most, still it is a public nuisance which no citizen who values health can view with indifference. Its removal before the heat of summer sets fairly in is most urgently demanded. And I didn't put this in there, but one of the things I really like is Dr. Monroe's office is over where the new museum is going, where the old post office, old city hall is. And there was a drain from the railroad down to 3rd Street in the alley between 3rd and 2nd Streets. It came right past his office home and went into the open ditch on 3rd Street, or then called Branch Street because it was a branch that ran down it. And he very much desired to have the privies that were emptied into that, directly into that, to be moved in the summer. I don't know why. Okay, notice that he does not name the owners of this lot, but points out that the marsh is on the old Shields Mill property. Does that mean that it was owned by Meady Shields, who died in February of '66? Or maybe it belonged to his widow, Eliza, who died later that year. Perhaps officials were reluctant to disturb her, or perhaps the property had been transferred to one of the kids' heirs, or even sold to someone else. And I need to get to the courthouse and do some more digging, but hey. Still, it's no surprise that a few months later, in November 1866, the month that Eliza died, the Seymour Times reported that the Board of Health and the City Council have from the beginning found it difficult to move forward amicably. The suggestions and report of the board, its members complain, have been passed unheeded by the council. Members, not passed as in put into legislation, but passed over, I think it probably should have said. Matters growing worse of late, 2 members of the Board of Health energetically sent in their resignation. Their resignation letters, according to Dr. Monroe, are fine specimen of indignant and sarcastic professional utterances. It occurs to us that the Board of Health that has no power to enforce its decisions and such measures as it deems necessary for the health of the city is quite superfluous. It isn't worthwhile to keep a Board of Health merely for ornamental purposes. You get the feeling some of this together today on a different level. However, we haven't heard the council side of the question. We only know that very many badly needed sanitary measures have been vigorously neglected. In the same issue of the newspaper, there were the letters of Dr. Price and Dr. Garish stating their resignations. Dr. Price wrote, since it has been recently demonstrated that a majority of the council of the city are so well versed in all matters relating to sanitary condition of the city, I deem that the necessity of a Board of Health no longer exists. Dr. Garish wrote that from the time of his appointment to the present day, he and other members of the board have, quote, endeavored to discharge the duties appertaining to our office to the best of our ability, directed by the light of experience and knowledge of the known laws of disease and health. But those board members are unwilling to tamely submit to so flagrant an outrage upon every principle involved in sanitary law as was so recently done by sanction of the council, together with the exhibition of knowledge of sanitary laws, so far in advance of that known to the health board, forces them to the conviction that they can no longer be of service to the city as a Board of Health. And the next item found, and we hope there were others in between, because, or maybe in the city council minutes, which I haven't gotten into from them, was in May 1867 when the city council was reorganizing committees after an election earlier in the month. Motion to elect a Board of Health, whereupon Monroe, Carlton, and Frost were elected as such board. That's all. The report continues with a motion that the marshal act as street commissioner, and then moves on to salaries and such. And they combined the marshal's job with the street commissioner job eventually, and didn't raise, well, they cut the pay, of course, for the street commissioner because they didn't need him anymore. But they didn't increase the marshal's pay, they just gave him the extra work. Wait, there's more. A letter to the Times in August 1869 notes that at a July council meeting, the Board of Health recommended the enforcement of an ordinance that regulates sewers, privies, hog pens, and so on. Now this is town council, right? How many of you live in town? The council had immediately passed a resolution directing the city marshal to enforce the ordinance. So now he's got 3 jobs, and I bet they didn't raise his pay then either. The council had immediately passed a resolution directing the city marshal to enforce the ordinance. According to the paper, however, a walk through the alleys will convince anyone that the Board of Health recommended only what was essentially necessary to the health of the community, and at the same time, one cannot avoid seeing that the city marshal has so far paid no attention to the resolutions directing him to enforce the ordinance. Here is a foul nuisance in our midst that is daily poisoning the air and injuring the health of the inhabitants of this city by sowing the seeds of disease. Things must have been worked out at some point between the original board, because in September 1869, the directory of officials listed in the paper said that Dr. Garish was back on the board, and the other members were Dr. Frost and Dr. S.H. Carlton. In 1870, the City Council approved the Board of Health's regulation requiring persons keeping hogs in the pens in the city limits to keep the pens clean and disinfected to avoid stink from June through September. The rest of the time it's okay. And that buildings used for slaughtering animals also were to be kept clean and disinfected. Shallow privies were to have raised embankments around them and were to be properly whitewashed and painted. Apertures closed and vaults frequently lined to counteract offensive emanations. The ordinance directed that lots of streets and alleys shall be kept clean of decaying animals and vegetable matters. I couldn't find it today, or while I was working on this, but somewhere I read about hog carcasses laying by the depot, over by the crossing. It's like, okay. And all places within the city limits containing stagnant water shall be filled or drained. The alley between 2nd and 3rd Streets from Indianapolis Avenue to Ewing Street and the ponds near Kaufman's Brewery require immediate attention. Stables for horses and other stock and hen houses were to be kept clean, whitewashed, and disinfected. The city marshal was ordered to, I love this, the city marshal, whose pay increase still hasn't been mentioned anywhere, once every 10 days, was ordered to, once every 10 days from June through September, to carefully inspect the privies, pens, slaughterhouse premises, alleys, and backyards within the city limits and report violations to the city attorney, who shall prosecute the offending parties. Now, here's the clicker to this. The council enforcing such penalties as may be provided by law, or as to them may be deemed just. Which means if you know the councilman, I guess, you might get off okay. Monroe, Shields, and Carlton signed the regulations as the Board of Health. In 1870, the board also recommended draining the chain of ponds on the northwest side of town, as well as on both sides of the O&M Railway west of town. The water thus is spread over a large surface of ground and wallowed in by stock becomes very offensive and deleterious to health. No expense that can be borne should be spared to get rid of those stagnant and disease-engendering ponds, and the board earnestly recommends that immediate steps be taken by the council to effect that object. Yet, while we recommend this, we would say that all sources of disease within the city limits proper should first be attended to. Okay, this was signed by Monroe and Carlton with Dr. Shields dissenting. I'd like to know a little of his thinking. Like, if we can't get it done, why pass it, maybe? I don't know. Another little sidelight from the health ordinances. Dr. Monroe had moved to his newspaper to Indianapolis in 1882, so this was not from him, but the Seymour Democrat wrote in 1883 about the death of Miss Angeline Ayers at the room occupied by her mother and father in the rear of Weininger's barber shop. The family had moved to town about a month earlier, and the paper reported that no one here knows anything about the family. They didn't socialize with other people or anything. Mr. Ayers had come to work at the Hub and Spoke factory the previous fall. Quote here, "It is claimed that his daughter took a chill some 10 days ago, which was followed by a severe attack of uterine hemorrhage, which she continued to have until a day or two before she died. An inquest was held, and from the evidence and surrounding circumstance, there seems to be little doubt but that the deceased came to her death from the effects of an abortion by means unknown. The case is shrouded in mystery. The family seems to be in very poor circumstances. Burial was in the city cemetery. Kind of sad. The Indiana legislature in 1881 had established the State Board of Health and provided for local boards to be established in each county as well as each incorporated city or town by January of 1882 if they didn't already have one. The physician named the secretary of the board, of each board, was deemed to be the health officer for that entity. And they were told to play nicely together. Within the 1882 deadline, all physicians and acutaires, I can't say it, were directed to register with the circuit court clerk and to report to the health board all births, deaths, the certificate of cause of death, and such other correlative facts as may be required of them. If a birth or death occurred with no physician in attendance, the head of the family was to make the report. The fine for failure to report was $5 to $10. All diseases dangerous to the public safety, such as smallpox, cholera, scarlet fever, diphtheria, and such occurring under observation of any physician was to be reported immediately to the county health officer. And parenthetically, anybody that's done genealogical research looking for people from 1882 to at least 1900 and possibly later already knows that this wasn't always complied with. I mean, you can try to find them and they're just, you can find their death in the paper, but you may not find their record. Is anyone familiar with the term accoucheur? A-C-C-O-U-C-H-E-U-R. I had never heard it, but while I was researching this, it said that physicians and accoucheurs were to report. Well, I found that an accoucheur is a male midwife. So does that mean most of the midwives were women? Did they not have to report? They took care of that later, but that right then it wasn't taken care of. Okay. In the 1892 rules, updated directives still required reports of deaths, and coroners were added as responsible for reporting deaths where an inquest was held but no physician had certified the cause of death. A reminder was issued again in 1895 about reporting. Any failure to perform said duty will subject the person so failing to the severest penalty of law, which wasn't defined. $5 maybe? I guess that would have been substantial then, maybe. Complying with the 1892 law, the Jackson County Commissioners named Dr. M.L. Boas of Brownstown as their secretary. The Brownstown newspaper noted that the preventative medicine had done much to reduce the spread of contagious disease in the East, and thorough maintenance of good public hygiene is essential to people's prosperity and happiness. We look forward with pleasure to the promised results of the establishment of state and local boards of health. A notice a couple of days later in the Seymour newspaper was, in regard to vaccination, which it is the duty of the local health boards to put in force. The notice said students and teachers would not be admitted to public or private schools without presenting a certificate of vaccination from a reputable physician. All unvaccinated persons coming all unvaccinated persons in or coming into the state were duty-bound to be vaccinated within 60 days from January 1st, 1882. Babies within 12 months of birth were to be vaccinated with reliable bovine virus. That caused a bit of controversy. Not so much here. I didn't see any letters or protests of any kind, but Dr. Monroe, being Dr. Monroe, at least while he was still here in the short period of time, reprinted letters from other papers where people were objecting. And his son, Dr. V.H. Monroe, yes, Uncle Doc to some people in the county. He, Dr. Monroe, younger Dr. Monroe, noted that the vaccinated shied out of the way for fear of a bump hurting their sore arm. Still, the Board of Health edict have little effect in arousing those who have concluded not to be manipulated with in that regard. The estimate by Dr. Monroe, who wrote a letter that was published in the Times, was that he thought fully 1/4 evade the operation or the vaccination, some being afraid, others being conscientiously opposed to it. The usual cost of vaccination was $1, which included the required certificate to give to the, well, wherever it was required, schools, whatever. The usual cost of vaccination was $1, which included this required certificate. But anyone vaccinates that desires to. So nurses, druggists, and parents could vaccinate. I don't understand that either. I don't know why. Monroe looked unfavorably upon the $1 charge being made by some physicians, noting that he charged 50 cents because the operation was simple and the virus itself cost 12 cents. Does that remind you of anything? Currently in vogue. In August 1882, Dr. Bose, as health officer, published a notice to township trustees, school boards, and similar officers that vaccinations were mandatory, blah, blah, blah. And he outlined procedures for recording the information in the classroom and then reporting it to him so that he would have a record of vaccinations. Oh yeah, okay. Some things never change. Did I say that before? Have I said that? In April of 1883, the Banner wrote that at Seymour they leave deep privy vaults filled with foul matter and water standing wide open in vacant and unfenced lots. This is what, 20 years after the first mention of that? And if anybody falls in or is thrown into one of them with murderous intent, they call it accidental drowning.
Oh.
It seems to be, well, it's not on purpose.
That's the way to go.
Maybe. Yeah. And if anybody falls in or is thrown in one of them with murderous intent, they call it accidental drowning. It seems to be a debatable question whether Michael Burkhart Sr. fell accidentally into the exposed valve on the old hotel lot opposite the O&M depot, or whether he was assisted into it by others who felt interested in the termination of his earthly pilgrimage. There is mystery about the death of Mr. Burkhart, to say the least of it, and the most rigid investigation should be made. You know where we're talking about? When Kevin takes his tours around the city, one of the places we stand is probably over this now covered vault, I hope. Where the railroad crosses, where the Walton Hotel was, or Centennial, yeah, when it burned down.
Is that kin to our former mayor?
I don't think so, because it's a different spelling. I didn't do his history. Well, I did a bit of it, but it doesn't mention that. Continuing with the same story, Dr. Monroe had moved his newspaper to Indianapolis, and he changed it to, the name of the paper to the Ironclad Age, or the Convoluted Seymour Times. It's a great newspaper, but he still kept an eye on Seymour and thus wrote about Michael Burkhart's death, because it sounds like he probably knew him personally because he'd been here for a long time. Mr. Burkhart was a German about 68 years of age. He had been a citizen of Seymour since 1854. He was a wagon maker at which business he labored hard early and late till about 10 years ago, when to the surprise of everybody who knew him, he suddenly threw down his tools and never could be induced to touch them again. He said he'd worked long enough and had accumulated enough to keep him the remainder of his days. From that day to the day of his death, he lived at his ease. He grew fond of jovial society and being of a generous disposition, he became the pet of boon companions, amongst whom he seemed to find his chief enjoyment. His health was undermined and his frame enfeebled by habits such association involved. Was he pushed? Mary Burkhart, the widow of the wealthy and retired mulatto wagon maker, sued the Masonic Mutual Benefit Society 2 years later for funds she was to have received upon his death. Without her knowledge or consent, her husband had switched the policy beneficiary to his son, who recently had been married, before his death, had been married. However, the courts decided that she should collect more than $26,000 despite that switch. The decision was appealed, and the eventual outcome I've not yet learned. I don't know.
3.
But who's keeping score? In a related matter, and still in the category of some things never change, Michael Burkhart's little daughter Annie, when she was about 3 or 4 years old, this is before his death, became a casualty of, quote, the folly of leaving firearms accessible to children, while she and some other children were playing at the home of Mrs. Grott near Seymour in the summer of 1873. The kiddos got hold of a loaded gun, which discharged as they handled it, with a ball passed through the hand of one child and entered Annie's side, making a pretty severe wound. I think she survived, from everything I can find. A lot of these things have no follow-up that's easy to find. Okay, how are we doing on time there? By 1887, a Dr. Stillwell was the health officer, and on his recommendation, the Brownstown trustees ordered tile to be laid for drainage of the marshy ground along the spring branch on the east side of town from Nose's blacksmith shop to a point near the rear of the Presbyterian church. The town was to pay for street and alley crossings, with the 4 property owners responsible for the remainder of the expense. And based on this description, I think the east side of town was, you know where the Ball Museum is at the History Center on Sugar Street? Well, from back of that was a blacksmith shop, and I'm pretty sure it would have been his. From there to the Presbyterian Church, which is where the Plan Commission office is now, at the corner of Sugar and Walnut, southeast corner. There's still a drainage problem in that area, just a little further east. Okay, the state, as I mentioned earlier, had issued more rules and regulations for health and safety in 1892. Somewhere here, I lost it while we were doing our song and dance. They published this ordinance so that people could read it. It was in very small print and took up 2 full columns of the banner. Well, not 2 full columns, but close to that. And it was signed locally by Dr. John N. Taylor, President, Dr. C.N. Metcalf, Secretary, and Dr. D.J. Cummings of Houston. The health officers were to supervise the location, drainage, water supply, heating, ventilation, plumbing, and disposal of waste for schools, and notify proper authorities of defects, and cause those same to be corrected. I bet that went over big. Householders who knew or suspected anyone in their household had a contagious disease dangerous to public health were to report immediately to the health officer. Physicians were required still to report. And parents with children exposed to infectious diseases were not to allow them to attend church or other public meetings or travel on any street or public highway. Anyone who visited such a building that had someone with an infectious disease was to make a complete change of clothing before going anywhere else, and had to be issued a certificate from the health officer. I wonder. Did that happen? Anyone not satisfied with the diagnosis of the attending physician was required to visit and examine the case in the presence of the attending, or any physician who was not satisfied with the diagnosis of the attending physician was required to visit and examine the case in the presence of the attending and act according to the rules. I'm not going to go into the smallpox, I think, at this point, but just one thing I particularly remember from that was that the county had its quarantines, and so people from Washington County, for example, were quarantined from coming in because I guess there was even more smallpox down there than here. And some guy was arrested because he came across down at, not Milford, what's the next one east on 39. It wasn't 39, but anyway, he was coming across the Muscatatuck there and was arrested. Okay, red warning cards or flags not less than 12 inches square were fastened to the door or other conspicuous spot at places where scarlet fever, measles, or diphtheria were present. Red for those. Yellow flags signaled scarlet fever, measles, or diphtheria, and black flags were for cholera. The attending was responsible for providing health officer with notice when the disease had subsided and proper disinfection had taken place. Whoever had charge of the body of anyone who died of smallpox was to see that they were buried within 12 hours of death. Bodies of those who died of smallpox, scarlet fever, diphtheria, or cholera were to be placed in their coffin as soon as possible and the coffin securely closed and never opened again. The funeral was required to be strictly private, and disinfection of the sick room had to follow prescribed methods that you got from the Board of Health. And we're still on the stagnant ponds and all this other stuff that hasn't really gone away yet. And the Board of Health was to inspect Elia missionary institutions. Anybody? New word for me. I'm probably not saying it right, but it meant charitable. Why they couldn't have just said charitable, I don't know. Okay, cemeteries were to be located hereafter within less than 1 mile of the corporate limits of any town or city of Indiana. That's what I don't fully understand, because the corporate limits are going to change over time. And I don't know what that was about. Brownstown and Seymour at least already had cemeteries within their city limits, or very close to, so we don't know. Okay. As I said at the beginning, I was confused between Dr. D.J. Cummings, who was, headline says, was county health officer for more than 50 years, but he started practicing here after the Civil War in 1869, and we've heard 2 other people, or 3, mentioned in here as county, not city, health officers. So I think they're wrong, but I don't know. Maybe they just meant he was practicing. But it actually says he was for more than half a century, or more than half a century. Should make fun of newspapers, or shouldn't. Okay. He was secretary when another reminder was published about removing rubbish and burning and burying it, or cleaning privy vaults and all that good stuff. Recommended ventilation for dwellings and cellars, and that stagnant pools of water be closed. Okay, in 1899, he reported that Jackson County had 260 marriages, 5 colored, 450 births, 217 males and 241 females, 5 plural and 5 colored. And it took me a while to figure out what he meant by plural, but multiple births, so 5 multiple births, twins or whatever. 265 deaths. Now this was just in the quarter from, wait, no, this was, yeah, I'm not sure if it's for the quarter or for the whole year, which kind of ruins the whole report. Okay. He found county buildings during his annual inspection to be in good sanitary condition, except for the jail, which because of its architectural structure was poorly ventilated. Public schools and their water supply was much improved over past years. And in general, the county was fairly good, except in the towns and villages where stock pens and foul privy vaults continued to exist. The county poor asylum had 38 inmates, 23 males and 15 females, of which 12 were insane and 2 idiotic. Dr. Cummings urged county commissioners to erect suitable wards for the insane as well as hospital wards for the sick at the poorhouse. The poorhouse and some of these other things could be a whole study in themselves. There's just a ton of interesting stuff about them. In spite of the above facts, Seymour citizens have persisted in contradicting and denying the reports for fear that it become generally known. If it becomes generally known, the attendance at the street fair would be cut short. So when a contagious disease makes its appearance in the community, reports are always more or less exaggerated, as was the case a few months ago when spinal meningitis was in the Brownstown community. The Seymour papers, especially the Democrat, published news of this nature then, and they should not hesitate to do so now since it's in their town. And they cannot blame the public for mistrusting them or giving credence to exaggerated reports. Sound like today? Again? Still? Even? Yet? Before the newspaper came out with the news, Dr. Galbraith of Seymour notified Dr. Cummings that another death of diphtheria had occurred 3 miles west of Seymour, and that continued for many years thereafter. Okay, that's where I was going to mention that I had confused the two, or was confused by the two. So Dr. DJ was the old one, and he was the father of Dr. Joe, who also, so between the two men, according to the reports, they were in charge of health in the county for basically 100 years, for record keeping and all that sort of thing. I will get that figured out, maybe, which one's which. Okay. Oh, okay. Indiana decided in 1905 that they should have a hospital for the insane, and Seymour decided that Seymour would be a pretty good place for that. So they made an effort. They appointed Seba Barnes, who was an attorney here, pretty well known, to go to the legislature and take some people with him and tell them what the benefits were. And long story short, the 5-member state commission that was appointed to review this came and they looked at several sites here. And I love it. There's 5 members of the commission and then the local people that were appointed to take them around. And they had, 5 buggies for them with one of the locals in each buggy, and 40 other people tagging along because they just wanted to know what was going on. The sites included the Veslige Farm west of town with the adjoining Hackman and Schneck land, the Raps Grove area east of Rockford Bridge, and the Eugene Grubb site east of the Standpipe and between 2 gravel roads. I'm not sure where that one is. I don't know.
Sorry, I'm slipping forward.
They also stopped at the new filtration plant just completed at the water company on Rockford Road, which is still out there. And after dinner at the Jonas Hotel, which was really lunch, at the Jonas Hotel, they visited Chestnut Ridge and other sites south of town and a Robertson site east of town. The commission, except for the governor, stopped at the New Lynn Hotel overnight before setting out the next morning for North Vernon, which along with Columbus and Madison also wanted this place. And I found no more stories. Oh, wait a minute, I said that wrong thing. I thought they stayed at the Jonas. Oh no, they stayed at the New Lynn overnight. Anyway, I found no other stories about this, and I think we all know where the hospital, Southeast Indiana Hospital for the Insane was finally built.
Madison.
Yeah. Okay. Dr. Cyrus Wilson was born in Jefferson County in Deputy in 1854, taught school for a few years in Jefferson County, Graduated from Mooresville College, and in 1881 from the Hospital Medical College at the University of Louisville School of Medicine. Practiced for a few years in Jennings County at Lovett. The Banner in 1891 wrote that, "We have met Dr. Wilson, who is recently located among us, and we feel assured that our citizens will find him a very safe physician and perfect gentleman." The North Vernon Sun wrote a few months later that the doctor had passed through there Saturday morning en route to his old home in Deputy. And then, in the few months that he has been located at Ewing, he has built up a large practice and is doing well. The Banner noted that the same month that Dr. Wilson intends erecting an office and residence as soon as he procures a suitable lot. He and his wife will make good citizens. The Banner reported that the good doctor had gone to Osgood one summer day in 1900 to witness an automobile race. Who knew they had races that early? The race was between the automobile and the horse, and it was very exciting, the newspaper reported, and the automobile won. The doctor is very much pleased with the machine and is thinking of getting one to use in his practice. Apparently, Dr. Wilson carried out his plan because the Banner in October 1901 reprinted a story from the Indianapolis Sun that Dr. Wilson had sued the Indianapolis Automobile and Bicycle Company to recover $265 advanced in payment for a steam road machine. Dr. Wilson said that on a test trip the machine gave out at Columbus, and that the expert the company sent along brought it back to the city, evidently Indianapolis, and has not since been delivered to him or the money refunded. Evidently the doctor eventually got a car. And the Banner reported in 1905 that Dr. Wilson and Jesse Walker had made a trip to Scottsburg on Sunday. The next report was in 1907, and Dr. Wilson holds the record for fast automobile riding between Brownstown and Seymour. Last Saturday morning, when P.J. McNerney was intending to go to Indianapolis, the train in Brownstown was late, and McNerney was afraid of missing his connection in Seymour. So he struck up a deal with Dr. Wilson to take him to Seymour in his automobile. They had 30 minutes to make it. The doctor said that he would attempt, and he was successful. They reached Seymour in 28 minutes, including 2 stops. Some days you can't do that now. On returning home, the auto went up Crane Hill at full speed, which is also a good record. The doctor certainly has a reliable machine and the right to feel proud of it. The Banner reported in April 1910 that Dr. Wilson and John Cunningham of Brownstown and Dr. Neil Matlock of Medora had gone to Indianapolis Sunday and purchased, through Dr. Wilson, purchased a new automobile for Dr. Matlock. John Cunningham drove the machine from Indy to either Brownstown or Medora in 3 hours and 20 minutes without a single accident. In early December 1910, the Indianapolis Sun listed Dr. Wilson among 11 individuals listed at the bottom of a page for the United Motor Indianapolis Company, which was offering a deal. Well, it compared the cost of owning a car to the horse and buggy costs, and then if people ordered a car in the off season, which apparently that was December, the cars were guaranteed for life, with the exception of tires and other accessories, of course. The Banner kept track of the physician with one type or another of report weekly for 30 years. Can you imagine? I don't know. I love it, but I'm not sure that the doctor would have. Okay, so in 1917, they reported that Dr. Wilson met with a peculiar automobile accident at Ewing last Friday morning when a light truck ran into his runabout. He was turning around and had to back. While backing, he did not notice a truck coming from the depot and ran squarely in front of it. The truck hit the back of Dr. Wilson's machine, bending it and knocking the tire from the wheel. The machine had demountable rims, and the peculiar thing about the accident was the fact that the rim and tire were both pulled off without breaking the valve or injuring the nuts which held the rim on the wheel. The tire was put back on and ran all day Friday without being inflated. The rim was straightened, so the car does not have the appearance of having been in a wreck. Dr. Matlock's car, by the way, did not fare as well. Reports from the local newspapers in 1911 said that Dr. Matlock had been to Chestnut Ridge. Now keep in mind that, as far as I know, he was in Medora. So I'm not sure why he was going. Somebody at Chestnut Ridge liked him, I guess. And he was accompanied by Dr. Scott Shields of Brownstown, who was on his regular dental trip. Dentists made house calls, who knew? He was, okay. On the return trip, they were going down the Zalman Hill, a mile east or west, depending on which account you read of Medora, when the brakes failed on a steep curve and the driver lost control. The machine turned over, caught fire, and was destroyed. Dr. Matlock was thrown out and pinned under the machine until Dr. Shields got himself out and then freed Dr. Matlock just as the spilled gasoline ignited. So that was kind of a, whew, and yeah. Dr. Matlock was badly bruised in addition to having a gash cut in his forehead. They walked home, presumably to Medora, after the accident, and Dr. Joe Cummings was telephoned to come to Brownstown to treat Dr. Matlock, who was unable to leave home the next day on account of the bad shaking up. I would think maybe so. That was not Dr. Matlock's only or first bad accident, the newspaper said, because 4 years earlier his team ran away and his injuries resulted in his being confined to his home. It was feared then that he would be an invalid the rest of his life, and for a long time he could hardly move. You want me to go on and talk about Dr. Budd? And, okay, I mean, it's, the hour is up. Okay. If anybody has to leave, I will not be offended. Okay. One of those who, 100 years ago, survived to a ripe old age was Dr. Harold Peter Budd Grassley, whose office for 30 years was a remodeled house where the Montgomery Elster Party law office now stands across the street from here. When he retired in 1971, after 53 years as a general practitioner and surgeon, he was interviewed by Carol Waite for the Seymour Tribune, and I'm drawing here from the profile that she wrote. Dr. Budd was born in 1893, a son of Dr. George G. Grassley, and often spent evenings in the early 1900s driving his father to visit rural patients. That chore sometimes would last from 4 to 10 p.m., and Dr. Budd was recalled that he was required to sit in the buggy holding the horse no matter how cold it got. And I would think maybe as hot as it got too. I think it could go both ways. I always said I'd have my kids hold my horse when I visited patients, Dr. Budd said, adding that he never thought that the horse might be replaced by that time. He interned in Indianapolis after being graduated from Indiana University School of Medicine, received his license in 1918, when, as he recalled, half of appendicitis cases were fatal, in part because doctors didn't operate until the appendix had burst. Okay, I guess how would you know? And somebody, I don't remember, somebody I was talking to was telling me about a nurse at the hospital who could tell somehow when it was getting ready to, and so they would operate and find that she was right, that it was ready, and so that saved people.
My dad's did in about 1939. He really died.
Interesting. Over here, or?
No, in Du Bois County.
Du Bois County, yeah, okay. Diphtheria still was to be feared, but by 1971, he said, many doctors never had seen a single case of it, so interesting how things changed over a period of years. He first heard the term coronary heart disease from a speaker of Jackson County Medical Society not long after he came back to Seymour to practice. He said such cases might previously have been called acute indigestion, the term a doctor might use when he didn't know what the problem actually was. Some things never change. Drug abuse was getting out of hand, he told Carol. Local druggist had told him that his biggest volume sale was a brand of tranquilizer. At the same time, too many individuals were taking amphetamines, such as diet pills, or mixing medications. He told of an individual taking medications prescribed by 6 different doctors. New symptoms occurred with the number and mixture of pills. I like this part. Dr. Budd, he's a person after my own heart. Dr. Budd believed in letting nature take her course. He thought too many people ran to the doctor too often seeking medication not really needed. He knew in 1971 that giving penicillin for colds could result in the miracle drug becoming ineffective when needed for a more serious disease. Okay, I think we'll stop it there, and someday I'll come back and do the hospital. Because there's a lot to that too. But it's very interesting that Mary Schneck gave $5,000 and a lot in memory of her husband, Louis, and made an offer to the city if they would match it. And so in 2 years they matched it and built a hospital. And they've been building on and building on and building on ever since. And
So that is the first hospital started
and
there?
not the same building,
Okay.
yeah. At Bruce and, I didn't put the map up of that one, but at Bruce and Poplar Streets, the northwest, east corner is where the first one was built. But then the nurses' residence, oh, I gotta show you this. This is the bathtub. The up-to-date bathtub shown in the ad is the kind being installed at the hospital. I thought that was cute. Okay, there's a script written for an order form for opium, etc. And the script is for cocaine tablet 118 gram, whatever. Okay. Oh, and then there's been some controversy over when this was actually built, the nurses' quarters and where. So I failed to put the date on there.
It was across the street from the original hospital, wasn't it?
Who's next to it?
Beside of it. Beside?
Yeah. Here's a picture from 1934 of the various doctors. I thought it was interesting. There's not a nurse inside. Couldn't they have taken their pictures too? I believe that's the nurses' quarters on the far end there. This is, and I wish there were other pictures of this, and maybe there are. I need to get over to the hospital and ask to dig through their files. I'm sure they would appreciate it. They have them in a place.
I kind of think some of that was there when I had a baby in 1964.
It was because my first baby was born in 1960.
I'm sure
That
I
front
have
building
steps.
was there then.
Yeah, there's a different angle.
Yeah, that's like an annex. It's like an annex on that end.
Yeah, they said it was connected with a tunnel in the basement, so the same janitor could
I've
put
got
coal in
pictures of
the
myself out
in the
there.
furnace. But I'd like to see them, were these torn down? These, both buildings, or are they incorporated somehow? They're surely not.
I think the parts of them were still in use, but I don't think they are anymore. I think they're finally gone, but it went further than you'd think that they would.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's what, I'm very confused about
That was
that.
there in the 50s.
There's still another view of
Now, see,
the,
that shows the house right next to the first building, so it had to have been either torn down or moved to get the second building in.
well, and the other thing is, it says that the entrance, when they opened the nurses' residence, back in that first booking, it says that people entered through the Bruce Street entrance. So that would be, presumably, Bruce Street here, and then this would be Poplar. Uh-huh. But on the other hand, there are other pictures where it looks like there's an entrance that goes up into the nurses' quarters, just like the stairs there. So I need to do a lot more digging into this. I'm sorry?
I think it was moved.
Okay.
And who thought it was a good idea to have all those stairs going to the hospital?
Yeah, that's one of the things that was written about in there, was the people remember when they were pregnant that they had to go up those stairs. What were they thinking?
Yeah.
That was one of the things to change when they moved it. And then there's 1983. And then another one of the things I didn't even get to was that there was Whitmer's, family medicines, which was here and eventually moved to Columbus.
Is that the Queen Anne that is for sale right now?
I don't know. It's
think
at
it
Watt
is.
Chestnut.
It looks like the old Belden Insurance,
Frisky's.
or for Doc Fisher's office right now.
Is it Bell? It is Bell.
No?
It's like it.
You had them on your tour, but I've got northwest corner of Chestnut and Third.
Oh, third.
Oh, wait, the business was at the northwest.
Yeah, that's where the city hall is.
I remember seeing this photograph on a house history website when I first moved here. That house is the first one I looked at because it's been for sale for a while. And that guy owned that house, and I think it's 623 Chestnut.
Thanks. I don't know. Sharon, I don't know.
Oh, sorry. 5.
Thank you all for coming, and I'm sure you have questions. Maybe not now, but
I think there's a DVD for rent that shows, it was done by the Burge family, you know which one I'm talking about? And there's copies of.
oh, do I know which DVD you're talking about?
But it shows
Oh, but that
Seymour
Burge family,
Centennial,
yeah.
and it shows
Yeah.
Christmas parades and stuff. It also shows additions being built onto the hospital because the Burge
Oh,
Electric did the.
yeah.
And I think it shows in there maybe moving
I had forgotten about that.
the nurses building maybe, possibly.
I will check.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else?
The library is my residency.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you for all the effort you put into this.
Well, there's more effort needs to be made.
The understatement. You did a lot, thank you.
Well, you're welcome. I enjoy it. That's my hobby.
Glad you had that.
Hey, at least with those steps, Jackson County didn't rank high with the obesity.
That's true. Although, look at some of those pictures.
Well, right now, we're leading Indiana.
I know.
Well, some things do change.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Don't forget to fill out your evaluation.
No, I'm
Tell them how
gonna take it.
great I
I
am.
was gonna take it with me.
Then we'll just call you for more programming.
I can say the N-word. No.
Sure, Janet, I'd be happy to do that.
Only if you get a computer that works with the overhead downstairs. It's too hot in here, or am I the only one that's
No, I feel stuffy.
too warm?
I don't feel bad.
We're not here working like this.
That's it.
Yes.
That is
Is it block one or the other?
well, yes, so.
Sorry.
You're right, I didn't.
I'll be back.
I didn't get your name.
Oh, Charlotte Sellers. Okay.
Favor to ask, I have a thumb drive in my car, and you have to get up next to it. Would you share that so I can do some research on
It'll
some of
be
that?
on the website.
Because we're on website.
So next week she's gonna
You're doing
fill me
that
out.
program.
One of the videos.